It's Professor Buzzkill, and I'm here with one of my favorite historians, someone who came on the show in our early days, Dr. Colin Woodward, and he's here to talk about his new book, his second book, called Johnny Cash, Country Boy. I remember when we were talking about this, Dr. Woodward, because we were talking about your first book the first time, but then you said you had been working on this, and I thought it was a fascinating thing, a scholarly look at a country and western singer. So anyway, first of all, let me say thanks for coming on the show.
Yeah, well, thank you for having me back. It feels like I was just on, but I guess it was a few years ago.
Yeah, I know. Well, things roll on pretty fast.
Yeah.
In the podcast world. One of the most interesting things about the book is, in fact, I think really the strongest part of the book, and the reason why people should get it, is you really do situate Johnny Cash in his time and place. And I know that that's a cliche, and people say that a lot, but it actually matters in this case, it seems to me. It matters that Johnny Cash was born at a certain time in American history, and it matters that he was born in a certain place in American history.
Yeah, for sure. And I mean, there are a number of arguments that I weave through the book, but basically I kind of wanted to reclaim Cash for Arkansas because he, lived in Nashville. He died in Tennessee. He's buried out there.
Uh-huh.
So if people don't know a lot about Johnny Cash, they might think he was from Tennessee, that he grew up there or whatever. But he was in Arkansas. He grew up there. He was there until he graduated from high school and went in the military. And the book started as me doing research when I was in Arkansas, because I lived in Little Rock for about 3.5 years. Mm-hmm. And I was finishing up my first book, but I wanted to write about a big Arkansan. And I knew Cash was from Arkansas. I knew some other people. Obviously, the Clintons are from there, but I didn't want to write about them or maybe some other people in music, because it did produce a lot of great musicians. And in the archive, I saw that there was a lot of great rare material that was photographs, audio footage. And the more I kind of started digging into the Arkansas story, the more of these treasures that I was finding. Found out all about these concerts he does for Governor Rockefeller in 1968. He plays a concert for prisoners in 1969 at Cummins Prison Farm, which was the only time he played for prisoners in his home state. So I think like you and a lot of other historians, I mean, you start researching something and just kind of starts snowballing. So I initially wanted to write about the prisons, and that just led into his time growing up during the Depression. Obviously, there's things later that happened in Tennessee, but I wanted to kind of focus on Arkansas and what he's doing in his home state, how his home state affected him, how he wrote songs about his home state, sometimes kind of explicitly, other times a little more subtly. But it had a deep effect on him, and he did go back numerous times, either to play concerts like he did for Governor Rockefeller, or just to visit family, go hunting or fishing. He'd play a show in Little Rock, and maybe he'd swing down to Cleveland County, where he was born, and hang out with people there. He used to hang out with Johnny Horton in Kingsland. Mm-hmm. So he's going back a lot. And I think when he was doing well, he visited more often. When he wasn't doing so well, he didn't come back. But I kind of use these concerts he plays in his home state to, provide these snapshots of his life and career, so that it's not just, like you said, talking about him or talking about a concert, but putting it in context, kind of why he is where he is, what it meant to him, what kind of meant to the people around him, because it's also a story about his family, his band, his fans. So I kind of put a lot in this book, and it turned out to be more ambitious than I thought it was going to be initially, and wrote a couple chapters. And I said, well, I think this can become an entire book. So I read more, did more research, and so it turned into a book. And so it's kind of a biography. It's kind of a social history. It's, a lot of genealogy, but also I wanted to talk a lot about the music, because that's what Johnny Cash is all about. So I want to talk about his music and where it came from.
Of course. Let's help the Buzzkillers, especially, we have a lot of international Buzzkillers. Let's help them understand where Arkansas is, and I mean that literally, the placing of Arkansas in the continental United States is really important for this story.
Yeah, definitely. And I don't know if you've ever been there. I had not gone there until I was working there. So Little Rock was all new to me, and the whole kind of Arkansas history was new to me. But it's an interesting state because it sort of has characters of the South. It has characteristics of the Midwest. It's a landlocked state, so you're not going to be, on the beach in Arkansas.
Yeah.
There's a lot of rivers, there's a lot of mountains, there's a lot of things to do outdoors, but it's kind of in the middle, actually, in the United States in terms, not just geographically, but also demographically. It's about 3 million people. It's about a mid-sized state, as big as it may seem when you're there. It's not as big as other states, but it is a fairly large state.
Right.
So, I mean, I think it identifies as Southern, definitely. It was one of the Confederate states, but it's got these different regions. It's got the Delta, the Mississippi Delta. It also has the Ozarks. When you get to the southwestern part of the state, it kind of starts to feel like Texas. So it's an interesting state just geographically. And Cash is born in Kingsland, which is in Cleveland County, which is kind of south central. It's south of Little Rock. As you go further south, it starts to feel more like Louisiana. So he's kind of basically in the center of the state, a small town, small by any standards, even Southern standards. So he spends a couple of years in Kingsland before they move up to Dyess in northeastern Arkansas, which is a kind of more classic Delta town, big cotton farms. So in a lot of ways, it's a very typical for its time kind of story in terms of rural Arkansas, rural South, growing cotton, picking cotton, those kinds of things. But it's also a very unique story because of the town where he grew up in. It was actually a federally sponsored farming town during the Great Depression. So it was part of the New Deal. They create this town for farmers so they can get a house, they can get some land. But the geography is very important because Dyess at first, it's heavily wooded, it's swampy.
We should remind us because the name of the town is
Dyess. Yeah, it's Dyess.
Dyess. D-Y.
Some people up there they kind of
D-Y-E-S.
pronounce it Dice almost, but it's in Mississippi County, so it's close to the river. And this was a cotton town, so they're growing a lot of cotton, making their living that way. And Cash hated cotton picking, but that's another story. So he didn't love farm work.
Well, I don't think anybody ever liked it.
No, I guess not. He was pretty good at it, but he certainly saw no future for himself as a farmer. Although as a student, he was one of the future farmers in America. That's it.
FFA,
you remember that, but
that's right. Yeah.
By the time he graduates, he's leaving the cotton fields behind, and so are most of the people living there. It's kind of a dead or dying industry at that point.
Yeah, being mechanized and everything else. But it's interesting. It's important when you say that the town being a Depression town, a town built for farmers in this specific time.
Sure.
Give us some context on that.
When I was writing this book, I've been a long time fan of your podcast. So there's sort of these myths that I wanted to take on in writing the book. And there's some, it may not myths, but misunderstanding kind of about where he grew up. Cash liked to frame it as he grew up under socialism because it was a government-sponsored community initially. There were socialistic aspects to it. There was a cooperative store where the farmers, were a part of. So it had elements of that, but nothing in this town was free. How it worked was the Cash family had to apply. There were only a certain number of farmers that could get this new plot of land. And so they had to drive up to Mississippi County from Kingsland. It was a trip that took 2 days, even though they're in a truck. So it's pretty far, but pretty slow back then.
Wow.
And they're given this house, but they have to clear almost all the land themselves. And it doesn't look like it does now. There were trees everywhere. They had to cut down the trees. They had to take out the stumps, and it's very low lying, so it could flood. But, all these farmers go up there to clear their own land. They got 20 acres of land. They got some livestock. So for the Cash family, it was a good deal because Cash's family was pretty much dirt poor for the first few years of his life. So moving up to Dyess was actually moving up for them. But they had to pay back their house. They had to pay for the land. It wasn't given to them. So, if you make a good cotton crop, you can eventually pay off your house, which the Cashes did. But a lot of people couldn't make it. They moved away after a year or a few years. So people are moving in and out. But eventually, there's a few thousand people in this town that started essentially from nothing, but they're given, this nice new house. It's small by our standards for the size of the family because there's 7 kids and the parents. But if you go in their house, which I have, I mean, it's not a shack. I mean, for a couple people today, it would be fine.
Right.
So they had this new house, but they had to work the land. So it's a hardworking community. You can't just be on the dole, as they would say in England. It's like you have to work or
Yeah.
you don't eat,
Yeah.
essentially, and you would lose your house. So Cash grew up in a hardworking family. He learned how to do all the cotton work. So it is a New Deal project, but like a lot of the New Deal, it's not really socialism. It's not just giving people things. There's a lot of that rugged individualism and kind of
Right.
pull yourself up by your bootstraps, even during the Depression and in this new community.
And of course, it's interesting because he's born in 1932, right? It's not as if the Depression hits when he's 10 years old and he's able to remember a little bit about what things were like before. For in his young life,
exactly.
that's all he's ever known.
When he is born, that is one of the worst times of the Depression, around 1933. Because initially, the stock market crashed, but then you have the bank failures later. And, once FDR is inaugurated, he begins the New Deal. But again, that's not till 1933. So there's a lot to do at that point.
Mm-hmm.
And, just because America being what it is, they can't go too far to the left without, making a mess of things for the Democrats. So, he grows up totally during the Depression. And I mean, as you know, and a lot of your listeners know, the Depression isn't really alleviating until World War II. So it's kind of like, congratulations, you survived the Depression, your reward is World War II. So, things are tough and there's just no money for a lot of people. Thankfully, the Cashes are a little better off than, they own their own farm. But, sharecroppers, tenant farmers, those kinds of people are really struggling. And I think one myth you might hear sometimes during the Depression is that it wasn't as bad in the South because the South was poor always. But that's not really true. I mean,
it was already
there
poor,
are huge pockets of prosperity in the South in the 1920s leading up to the Depression. It's not a great time for farmers in the 20s. And so when the Depression hits, a bad situation becomes even worse. So Dias and the New Deal is really a lifeline for the Cashes. And they're, pretty much everybody there is a Democrat, but there are differences among Democrats too. I think Cash's family was probably more on the conservative end because of, them being in the South and a Jim Crow society and everything, but they weren't especially political. But you do have the Southern Tenant Farmers Union in the area organizing. So, there's a lot going on during the Depression politically that changes the way the South has been for generations. And that's because of the Depression. People, become a little bit more radical. They might unionize. Cashes weren't really a part of that. But I think Cash is absorbing, obviously, everything that's going on. So I think he's, as part of his rootedness, I think, is not just in rural Arkansas, but also it's the Depression in terms of, you have to work, you have to work to eat.
Yeah.
So even though he didn't like, as you said, no one likes working in the cotton fields really, but he is a hardworking guy, and that carries over into his career. And it's just a matter of what am I going to do once I graduate from high school for Cash. But all that, definitely makes a deep impression. And as Michael Stewart Foley has written, really creates what he calls the politics of empathy with Cash, that he always kind of empathizes with the lower sorts, the oppressed, prisoners, Native Americans, just general, poor people, hardworking people. So that he never really loses that kind of blue collar attitude. I don't think.
Now, what is it about his early years in the Depression that make him want to, branch out into music. I mean, the standard cliche is to say that everyone provided their own entertainment in those days because you couldn't either couldn't afford to go to see things or hear things, or because it was just that was the way things were done in rural America. But you had said earlier, and it's obviously in the book, that he really doesn't like cotton farming. How does he start to see, or how does he eventually come to see music and entertainment as a way out, as a career?
Well, I think, like a lot of people, he was obsessed with music when he was younger. There's a lot of it in the churches that he went to. And, that's a long history of where gospel music comes from, and spirituals are part of the church history. So he's learning it in the church. His mother was a little bit of a musician, not his dad, but his mother's side a bit more. But I think really what does it for Cash is the radio, because in the 1920s, the radio is starting to be in households. So he's listening to the radio all the time. I mean, the way you and I might have been watching TV all the time. I know I certainly was watching TV all the time.
Right.
But that is the biggest form of mass media at the time. It's not just music. It's, radio shows and politicians, the fireside chats by FDR and everything. So he's listening to the radio all the time. He's hearing all kinds of music, not necessarily just country, but, whatever pop music is on, just kind of a variety of things, because radio wasn't as specialized as it was now.
Yeah.
And it wasn't necessarily 24 hours a day. So you had to kind of be there in the room to listen to it. People just look at the radio and listen.
Yeah, that's
so
right.
He's absorbing all these songs from what he's hearing on the radio. He is singing them in the cotton fields, like you say, and kind of to keep himself company, to keep other people company. And it was just something that was in his blood to a large degree. He loved music. I think it was kind of a release. It was a spiritual thing too, but it was just something that he always wanted to do. He said that he had one music lesson his whole life, and the teacher said, you have a great voice, you have a great gift, don't let anyone mess with it, essentially. So he kind of walks out of there after one lesson, and he has a friend that teaches him a few guitar chords when he's in Dias. His mom maybe did a little bit, but doesn't really take to the guitar till later when he's in the Air Force. But he's really processing all these songs, and he just had a naturally good memory for remembering songs. I mean, later, some people, I believe them, thought that Cash probably knew a few thousand songs.
Sorry, you often hear people of this period talk, and especially if they're agricultural workers, talking about the sort of rhythm and the monotony of agricultural work, particularly hard physical agricultural work, as sort of having a beat to it. And field songs are there because field hands are doing things in a certain, specific rhythmic way. And I sometimes wonder whether cotton picking was kind of like that.
I think so. And I think that goes back to the antebellum period. If you read about slavery, the slave songs that come out of the church, but also come out of the field work, they do want to keep a certain rhythm while they're working, because they're supervised. So, they have to get their work done, but they also kind of want to have their own rhythm to it. And, you'll see this in movies sometimes, like in Cool Hand Luke, when initially Paul Newman is working too fast, and one of the guys next to him is like, hey, slow down. You're not going to last 3 hours. There is a certain rhythm to the work, so you don't exhaust yourself, and also just to distract yourself from how boring it is. And it's a really interesting time period to read about, because it's not just people like Cash, it's other people that become musicians in the 50s, rock and roll guys, a guy like Sonny Burgess, who's from Arkansas, or Carl Perkins. They were guys who spent a lot of time in the cotton fields. And so, getting out of there was important. But I think, they sort of learned this rhythm. And later, when Cash is listening to the Lomax field recordings of African-American music, which are pretty basic in terms of it might just be guys singing a cappella, essentially, but it is coming out of that tradition of agricultural work, field work, where a lot of these songs develop these kind of folk songs that Cash will reinterpret later. But I think, him hearing those recordings for the first time must have been pretty astounding, not just the sound, but also, well, this is kind of what we all do to a certain degree, whether you're white or black. If you're working in the fields, you're going to kind of have these same behaviors and these same kind of musical patterns or whatever you want to call them.
We should remind Buzzkillers that Alan Lomax and other people went out into rural America and recorded a great number of songs and a great number of even dances, even sort of schematically recorded them. And as taken as a whole, it's a tremendous archive of American cultural life at the time. It's something that if we hadn't had, the 20th century really would have been missing something.
Yeah, and early in Cash's career, he records a song called Rock Island Line, which had been done by a lot of people, but had its origins in Arkansas and prisoners. So Cash is able to listen to these things, absorb these things, and then kind of do it in his own way. But yeah, a lot of them come out of those field recordings. Lead Belly, the famous blues musician, he was a prisoner at one point. So in the 30s or when the Lomaxes are doing these are really amazing recordings because people hadn't heard this kind of thing.
That's right.
Even though they had been in the folk tradition for a long time. But it all goes back to, blue collar work, guys that are working on the railroads or guys that are working on a prison farm. It all comes out of that.
But here's where we see the essential myth-busting part of the book. I mean, the book is much more than just a myth-busting book. But people tend to think of Johnny Cash and that sort of Carl Perkins and those sort of guys as sort of like, the sort of outlaw type of music. And it's really not that. It's not talking about outlaw. It's not coming from an outlaw life. It's coming from a very hard laboring agricultural life.
Yeah, that's an important part of the story, I think, because Cash, he's sort of the mediator between early country and later country that becomes kind of outlaw country. And now on Sirius XM, you have Outlaw Country, and you hear Cash on that. You hear a lot of people. But he sort of is, I think, calling the book, he's kind of the godfather of Outlaw Country.
Yeah.
But people did have this idea that, he had been in prison. He had never been in actual prison. He'd been arrested a number of times for like a night or something while he was drugged up. But, Cash kind of rode that line. I mean, early song about that, walking the line. But it's kind of like he liked to use these stories either from like the Wild West or wherever that he's talking about outlaws, and his own kind of persona, his own behavior was kind of reckless and criminal. But like you say, I mean, all this stuff is kind of grounded. It's in the churches, it's in folk history. I mean, he does write his own songs. They're really original and great, but he doesn't necessarily want to go too far with that outlaw persona.
Yeah.
Because he's a Christian guy. He's a religious guy. He's a married man who has kids and everything. So he doesn't let that, it's a struggle, but he doesn't want that to kind of take over his life. But he's enough of an outlaw to convince prisoners that he's a badass and that he can navigate kind of all these waters. He's sort of in Nashville, but he's not really of Nashville. So he's able to be an outsider, and it's not necessarily outsider the way criminals are, but just kind of an outsider in terms of his background in Arkansas. A lot of these guys are from a blue collar background, but there is kind of a unique story to Cash. And so he doesn't want to be pigeonholed as the outlaw guy or even the country western guy. He would just kind of say, well, you got to call me as you see me. I'm kind of my own thing. And musicians I've talked to are like that. They don't like to be pigeonholed, even if they're obviously a heavy metal act or a country act. Even if they are one of these more outlaw guys, they might reject that. So, yeah, I mean, Cash, he sort of avoids labels his whole career and just kind of wants things, he goes through this evolution a number of times. So he just kind of wants to be judged on his own terms and just kind of be Johnny Cash.
Well, let's talk about the evolution a number of times, because as you say in the book and as all the promotional material says, lots of people think of Johnny Cash as coming from Tennessee, and his connections with the Carter family and everything strengthen that. But there are ways in which, and there are reasons for him sort of reinventing and recasting his image as he goes along.
Yeah. Well, even just his name. I mean, because because when he's in Dias, he's known as JR. But when he's in the Air Force initially, he's filling out his paperwork and it's John Cash
Yeah.
or
Right.
John R. Cash. But then when he's in at Sun with Sam Phillips, he becomes Johnny. And that has more of a, country singer ring to it.
Yeah.
And it sounds kind of youthful, but also maybe a little more outlaw. And there are all kinds of country guys, Willie Nelson, Johnny Paycheck. I mean, all these guys that kind of have a similar type of name. So in a way, he doesn't have to totally change his name, but he does kind of reinvent himself that way. And so there are definitely different periods in Cash's life. He starts in Memphis, but then he moves to Columbia in 1958. In Columbia, he's recording in Nashville. So Nashville's kind of pulling him in, but he resists it for a long time until really he marries June Carter Cash, and then he decides to settle in Nashville then. But he's in really bad shape just before they get married. So he has to kind of clean himself up. And then when he does the concert at Folsom, that sort of reinvents him again because it's such a huge hit. He gets the TV show the next year, and that kicks off a whole different period for him where he's on TV every week. Every album is kind of a blockbuster. He gets a new guitarist in 1968. So, for a variety of reasons, he's sort of a different person to a degree, depending on what time period you're looking at. But I think like anybody or any musician, he kind of wants to keep what makes him what he is there. So he doesn't want to lose this formula that has worked for him. So that this kind of notion of being a roots musician or being rooted, he thinks a lot about that, like kind of what do I need to do? What kind of sound do I need to maintain to not only be successful, but also just kind of stay true to myself. So for a while, even after he's hugely famous, he's got this mansion, he's got a farm outside Nashville. So he's doing really great commercially, but then he sort of starts to lose that artistic juice or inspiration, whatever you want to call it, as kind of the 70s go on.
Yeah.
So he has troubles artistically, even though he's still hugely popular. He's still a big draw in concert. And so this kind of sets things up later in the 1990s where he has yet another comeback. So I had to carry this story really up to his final days because it's really an ongoing story with him. It's an evolution that doesn't stop. I'd be interested, he died fairly young. So if he lived another 15, 20 years, he'd maybe be doing some other, very different, unique things with his music.
Well, let's talk about that 1990s sort of rebirth or revival or whatever, because I remember coming out, I was in graduate school, and you're talking about what was called basically the American recordings, right?
Right.
And it's a very stark and stripped down and basic presentation of these common American songs of that time period. But a lot of it is bleak. A lot of it is hopeful in a way. I don't know if technically if it was just him and his guitar, but I remember landing in the cultural landscape, the musical landscape, as sort of this asteroid, because lots of people were flocked to it because it was just so authentic, or they felt it was so authentic.
Yeah, unfortunately, I seem to have missed all this because the first time around, because I don't think I really knew much about him until Walk the Line came out.
Right.
And so me getting into all the recordings, and I skipped around. So one day I might be listening to the Sun Records period. I might be listening to, later that day, the Rubin stuff. So there's so much. So there's a lot to digest. But the Rubin period it's really interesting. It's kind of his last comeback. It starts in 1994. That's the first of the American Recordings albums, as you say, collectively known as that, although the first album is called American Recordings. Yeah, he just strips everything down. It's him and his guitar on that first album. He's not even using a pick.
Yeah.
And he's got some original songs, but he's also reinterpreting what other people are doing. He goes back, like Delia's Gone, which he recorded in the 50s, but he makes a music video that becomes controversial because Kate Moss is getting buried in this like black and white kind of gothic setting and everything. So he really just kind of connects, I think, with the zeitgeist, I guess. Sort of grunge, hip hop is big. Cash is able to kind of tap into that, even though he's really not using anything different than what he first did, which is just him and a guitar. And that's how everybody pretty much has started as a musician that plays, is you're playing a guitar in your room. He records these songs in Ruben's living room, and they just take off. They really connect with the public in a surprising way, I think. I think Cash was surprised, but this is what he wanted to do, and kind of Rube for a long time. And Ruben I think just kind of gave him permission. He's like, you want to do acoustic songs that you like? Go ahead and do them. I'll record them. And so that's what we get. We get like 12 songs of just Cash and his guitar on that first album.
Like I said, I remember it being a hugely influential, and I remember people sort of being stunned by it, sort of stopping and thinking.
Yeah.
Like, almost stopping in your tracks sort of music. Because, of course, when I was growing up, Johnny Cash was the guy on the weekly television show, and he was with the Carter family and all that stuff, and you didn't... and the Folsom Prison recordings were very famous and kind of funny as preteens. We thought, oh, he's singing about prison. And, it's kind of like, a little bit of outlaw there. But then he reaches back and just drags up these very, very intense songs in the 90s and makes them even more zone. And even as his voice deepens further as he gets older.
Yeah. And I think, once those recordings came out, and it's weird because like Cash is still kind of putting out albums every couple of years, something will get pulled out of the archive and they'll make a record. I think he had to kind of go darker in a way. I mean, he's always been kind of this dark guy, but when you're such a huge star like he was in the late 60s and 70s, you can become a self-parody if you're not careful. And he kind of became that in the 80s. So I think if he goes super dark, like you said, people were sort of stunned, and he's kind of making people think, like, well, what is he doing? Why is he doing these songs? But it really, in a way, wasn't necessarily anything new. I mean, the approach was different from what he had been doing, but there are tons of recordings with him just on a guitar. It's just that at this point, he had a producer who supported him and said, let's try to do it a little bit differently. Don't worry about your band. Don't worry about any hits. And it worked. And so those albums sold pretty well. But Cash being Cash, he plays with Tom Petty and the Heartbreakers. So a lot of those songs they're straight up rock songs or country rock, whatever you want to call it. So it's not just the acoustic stuff. And he tries out a lot of different things. And a song like Hurt, which is just Cash on his guitar, taking a Nine Inch Nails song and reinterpreting it that way, he reinvents it and kind of makes it his song to the point where now Trent Reznor plays it the Johnny Cash way.
Interesting when that happens.
So it's really interesting to see how this stuff works. A lot of Johnny Cash songs that aren't his necessarily kind of become his, just doing it the Johnny Cash way.
Well, Dr. Woodward, I could geek out on this all day long because I love this kind of Americana stuff. and I was big into the Ry Cooder thing and all that stuff back in the 70s and 80s and 90s.
Yeah.
But we want Buzzkillers to go out and get the book. We want them to go back on whatever music streaming service they're doing and look at Johnny Cash's American recordings and his early recordings and you really see that there's a lot more than the weekly television show image behind Johnny Cash, and it's much deeper and much more interesting. So thank you so much for coming on the show.
Thank you, Joe. Appreciate you having me back. I really enjoyed it.
And Buzzkillers, the book Country Boy, The Roots of Johnny Cash, is, of course, on the Buzzkill bookshelf. It really, really does make you appreciate Johnny Cash's development in a way that I had never appreciated it before. So, again, thanks very much.
Thanks, Joe.
And we'll say to the Buzzkillers out there, we'll talk to you next week.